How are we doing this morning? And I feel like that's such a crappy question to ask on day 2 of a conference. We know how we're doing, okay? You either were out at karaoke last night or somehow got a good night of sleep, right? So are we having a good time? Awesome, much better question to ask. As Jeremy said, my name is Erin Mikail Staples, and today we're going to go and talk about one of my favorite things, which is how to break things better. How many people have pushed to production on a Friday? I love you people. You're my kind of chaos people. But again, a little bit about myself. My name is Erin Mikail Staples. I'm a developer experience engineer at LaunchDarkly. I'm also a stand-up comedian, dog mom. You know, important things in life. Today, we're going to go on a little adventure. First off, we're going to talk about, can you move fast and still not break things? Or is this like kind of some weird paradox that we're living in? We're going to also talk about how to set up our development process for resiliency. What does it look like when we build resiliency into our development process and our release process? And lastly, but not least, we're going to talk about how to develop a culture that allows you to test things out and experiment, that allows you to continue to do things like push on Friday, right? So first things first. And I'm going to do something that I never thought I would do at a conference, which is, I'm going to quote Mark Zuckerberg. We all remember in 2009, he was like, if you're not breaking things, you're not moving fast enough. We saw how that is turning out still. So I'm just going to let him speak for himself.
You know, what I really mean by move fast is that I want to empower people at the company to try things out, and I don't demand that every iteration of what we release is perfect. What I want to optimize for is learning the most and having the best product 3, 5, 7 years from now, right? Which you can do by iterating quickly, getting feedback, learning and going.
All right, we always love, a live video play with some audio issues, but put in short, it's all about moving quickly and allowing you to actually process the feedback. But what good is feedback if you actually don't listen to it? Or in the case of me, break things because you're testing live on a stage, right? What's the point? We often move from that to, come on, tech world. We move that, and the way that we think about development, we change our development process to reflect that. So in the case of our normal development process, what we have is, as an engineer, you have a branch. We make a change, we create a branch. Then we start to deploy code to that separate branch or that environment. And that part is pretty straightforward. We've been here before, we've done this before. You're just taking the code, moving it to a different environment. And then we start to think about that release and that deployment process. So again, this is when we're starting to move it down that pipeline, see what happens, rolling it out through that deployment process, and release. But here is often where we start to see things go a little bit chaotically. One thing that we do at LaunchDarkly to kind of reduce that friction is we separate the deployment from the release process, meaning every time you deploy, you're not necessarily releasing a feature, it's hidden behind a flag. That mitigates some problems, right? You can kind of test yourself. If something goes wrong, you can undo it. Easy enough. But that doesn't solve the human problem. When we put things out in the world, we're not solving and optimizing for the end user experience. What if we released a feature that was honestly kind of crappy? Has anybody released something that was terrible? I'll be the first to do it. I'll tell you a story. I once was my first tech job where I wrote code for pay. We worked on a e-commerce app, and one of our engineers made a lorem ipsum that was different words of fart in different languages. Guess what got shipped? Guess what branch we thought we were on? Yeah, not great. Really not great explaining that to a client. Looks something like this. Now, however, just like the questionable fashion choices of our early 20s, we now know that some things are just better off when they're putting together, like production environments and the mental health of developers on weekend calls. So that all being said, we have shifted the way that we release software. If you've ever experienced downtime, you know that a single hour of downtime outside of the emotional turmoil and stress that it causes costs an organization about $100,000, and that's according to a Gartner study. That's expensive. Now, 80% of those incidences are caused by code changes, and a lot of times, half those costs go to finding and fixing bugs. I spent an hour on last week trying to chase down a wrong API key. Go me. But how do we prevent these issues and build for resiliency? Well, we could just decide never to ship anything at all. We could play it really safe with our releases and make sure that we're doing things. But instead, let's talk about what it looks like when we do a controlled release process. So we'll talk about the different ways that we can control our releases. So first off, we'll approach the targeted feature flag route and walk through what a controlled rollout looks like, where you're going bit by bit at a time. So first, that means shipping just to our developer environment. So when we ship, it's kind of an internal, maybe it's QA. Let's turn that on. Only our internal developers and QA teams are seeing that. We're controlling the release by a feature flag to the mass public. The next stage is sometimes we put it out to those beta testers. So that's one of my favorite things I love to do when I'm in the software world. I love working with beta teams. I love working as beta testers. It's a highlight because it's fun. Like, you get to see your first reactions of people. And this is a chance for you to get feedback. So sometimes that can be internal team members, sometimes that can be external, depending on how your organization has it structured. Then you go all the way to the general availability. This is hopefully, fingers crossed, you've gotten all those bugs under control, but we still do see sometimes errors happen, and this is usually due to the mass scale of rollout. Scale can bring and opens yourself up to more risks. We've all heard that whole thing, works on my machine, right? Or works just like this on my instance. We've all been there. Now that we've known that we can make it through that basic controlled release, and we've done our audience targeting in a way that allows us to make sure we're controlling every aspect, who it's going to, and how it's going to them, this looks a little differently in our product. So if you're curious what it looks like under the hood, you can do this both with front-end and back-end examples. So this is my beautiful, highly technical drawn architecture. I'm totally a stick figure person, by the way. So in our normal thing, if we follow that bottom flow, currently we're just going through releasing something to the front end, turning that flag on, and we can connect a new back end to that via API. Then we'll move on, and we can swap in and keep that original database. Say we want to optimize that database, we can turn that on and completely release our pipeline. So if anything ever were to go wrong, you can undo or flip something back as simple as a toggle. Pretty neat. That would make releasing things a lot easier, right? If you could just turn it on and off like a light switch. But what else can we do to improve that end user experience? This part goes to actually experimenting and implementation. Now, I love data. Data's great. Making decisions is easy. We all made a decision to come here today. You made a decision to have decaf or not. You all made a choice. Sometimes inaction is a choice. If you ran late here and you didn't pick up a coffee, I'm sorry, but that was a choice. Now, was that the right decision? You tell me. Sometimes we don't know a decision until its aftermath, and we're not coming up with a consistent framework in order to determine what decisions are successful. When we're planning to mitigate chaos and mitigate risk, this is super important to think about. Now, we can have a lot of ways to make a decision. We can flip a coin, let some leaders do it, ask ChatGPT, copy the competition, roll a dice, and so on and so forth. Now, we need to make sure that we're taking a data-informed approach to these decisions. It's one thing to just test and explore, but first, we should probably have some goals. When we release this feature, what do we want to achieve? I love using e-commerce as an example for this. Like, e-commerce is pretty straightforward, right? Our goals of e-commerce are to sell things, make money. Pretty easy. Checkout cart conversions are a nice way. Now, we want to avoid outcome bias. So outcome bias is when we think that we have the right answer, and we think something, and we almost will it to be. We make sure that we're overcompensating for what's going to happen. So we want to make sure that we're documenting decisions as we make them. Every time we make a decision, just simply as like writing it down in a decision document can help that. And lastly, have transparent and objective criteria for decisions. How do we know that the decisions we're making or the features that we are releasing are the best features? Sure, it's one thing if we raised our checkout, like the average checkout value to $1 million. That'd be pretty sweet. But if you're only getting one person to check out, that's not the best end solution. So lastly, when it comes to preventing chaos in your releases, one thing you can do is making sure that you're doing a metric-informed rollout. Great, we released that new feature, but what does that actually look like from a metrics perspective? And we can think about metrics in a bajillion different ways. Now, we think about metrics, we can use a metrics like Segment, we can bring in our latency metrics, we can use a tool like Sentry to pull in metrics from, but at the end of the day, we want to understand the impact of the change. So if we think about metrics in terms of what is this impacting in my business? I think JT said it earlier yesterday when we talk about how do we think about things in terms of ROI. Is it worth the time and energy going to it? Is it worth the risk or the impact on users? So again, we're always looking to optimize the impact of scale while reducing that risk. And we'll do so over a series of time. So doing a controlled rollout allows you to do this as soon as you're starting to get that feedback. So again, if we're doing an experiment and we're getting those A/B tests and getting that results, we can iterate automatically. And we know which is the best decision. We have the data to prove it and roll that right out all the way through deployment, or all the way through the release. Now, we love talking about this, and it's all great in theory. We can use all the tools in the world. But there's the phrase, like, all tools suck. I love this. But there's definitely some truth to all tools are equally terrible. How many times have we got a new tool or a shiny new object and thought it was going to solve all our problems? That planner totally made me organized. That Google Calendar, I bought a new watch, fitness watch. I worked out and ran marathons every day. I would love to have that work, realistically. However, that's not always the case. We need to create and cultivate safe-to-fail environments. I think Laura said it really great on her talk yesterday. How do we build environments and places where people are feeling trusted to go to other people? And sometimes that requires having the right amount of context. When it comes to that, we want to make sure that we understand what we're getting into. I like to kind of use the metaphor of a high dive. If I showed you this picture, how many people would go right off the high dive and jump in? Maybe like one or two. If I just said, hey, let's go swimming, and then led you up to the high dive, how many people would also go in? In order to make sure that people feel confident in making a decision, we have to make sure that they have the right amount of information. And that means being transparent and honest and building them up. Maybe instead of jumping off the 10 meter at start, we start on the 3 meter, or we just start diving off the side of the pool. Maybe if we're getting on a high dive, or even diving at all, we make sure we know how to swim. Doing it in an incremental approach can help build confidence in your teams. Maybe it's just a feature fix or kind of an improvement rather than a full-scaled rollout. Then you want to make sure that you're providing resources to success. That means 2 parts. One, you got to give yourself dedicated time and space. And sometimes the best thing you can do is give yourself team time to think about problems that aren't the ones that right are in hand. Let that creativity explore. Also, set aside money and a budget for innovation. And understand that not all the time, innovations don't work out. I mean, sometimes they do, and you have things like the cronut, right? Croissant, donuts, great. Wonderful innovations. Other times, like toasters and bathtubs, they less so. But we need to make sure that we're taking calculated risks. And we're doing so with a budget to make sure that we can take those risks. And if all else fails, have that undo button, whether that's a feature flag where you can roll it back, or other things that you can easily get out of. You're testing locally, you're making sure things work before merging it upstream. Next, you want to make sure that we're rewarding and recognizing the talents. Sure, of course, it's very easy to get excited about the things that actually made it to the end release. But what decisions and how are we acknowledging the things that we discovered along the way? How do we make sure that we're acknowledging that and rewarding that just as much as people who are releasing big things? That takes a culture of making sure that we're embracing the journey, so to speak. But most importantly, above all, we need to make sure that there's great communication, transparency, and trust among teams. Now, this could look a lot of different things, like how do we make sure that we're acknowledging the discoveries? I think one of the best teams I've ever seen that does this is solutions engineers. I always talk about they're my favorite people to work with in an organization. Because solutions engineers, they've seen it all. Like, solutions engineers can undo just about every problem or figure out how problems were created. So it's really great when you kind of work with them and have this open transparency. The best solutions engineers that I've worked with have usually post-mortem docs, or like they'll give you a debrief of what happened or an incident report. And it helps you kind of understand and create this culture of communication that isn't available. So how can you open up your team to not only the success stories, but when things aren't going so hot? But whatever we're doing, I love this acronym. We want to make sure that we're giving feedback hard. We can give feedback if it's honest, accurate, respectful, and direct. Remember that explicit is kind. If people don't know the problem, they can't resolve the problem or improve the problem. And lastly, make sure that you have a safeguard in place. What does happen if the worst case scenario comes true? How do you protect yourself? How do you protect your organization? And how do you protect your team? What are you doing to make sure that you're mitigating risk before risk ever happens? Talking about that proactively and having a plan in place allows you to actually have these conversations when something does happen. If we can't talk about it, we probably can't solve it. So go ahead, push to production on Friday. Push before write that big game. Log off, knowing that you've had the safeguards in place. And that's all.